Arguably, the greatest threat to President Vladimir Putin's 22-year rule came from this most recent event with Wagner Group leader Yevgeny Prigozhin in a months-long dispute with Russia's defense ministry over the conflict in Ukraine. It's an abrupt about-face. Prigozhin said he called off his troops' march on Moscow and ordered them to move out of Rostov. Prigozhin has since agreed to leave Russia and relocate to Belarus as part of a settlement mediated by Belarus. He won't be charged, and Wagner forces who took part in the uprising won't be subjected to punishment. Joining me now to unpack these developments is Spector, Daily Maverick Associate Editor and International Relations Analyst. Brooks, very good morning to you. Thank you so much for your time. Can we perhaps start right at the beginning with some groundwork, understanding the Wagner Group, because what we essentially know is that they're a private army of mercenaries that have been fighting alongside the regular Russian army in Ukraine. Perhaps unpack it for us.
Yes, good morning. Good to be with you. I mean, yesterday it looked for all the world to many people around the world that we were going to see something approaching a change in government, a change in leadership, a change in some structures in Russia. Now it looks like that threat has receded, at least initially. The basic situation was that Yevgeny Prigozhin, gosh, we're going to have to get used to that name, aren't we, a lot more. His private army, he had risen from being an ex-con to a hot dog vendor to a kind of Russian version of a tenderpreneur in providing catering services to Russian military and other government offices, and a favorite of Vladimir Putin, to running a mercenary army that had interests and activities in many countries in Africa, as well as being what amounted to the sharp point of the stick in Putin's war of choice against Ukraine, most notably in the battle around the settlement of Bakhmut in the eastern Ukraine that basically had come to a halt just a little while ago. But Prigozhin, his annoyance with the Russian army, the regular army, was both deep and pervasive, and he had increasingly chosen to attack the military leadership, both as an institution and by name, for being craven and unwilling to support his units with weapons, with ammunition, with supplies, and this anger, this annoyance, this whatever rivalry, whatever we want to call it, has eventually spilled over, and he led what amounted to a kind of march on Moscow to force something, and none of us are really quite sure what the something was that he wanted to do besides get rid of the military leadership. Did he want to push Vladimir Putin into retirement? Did he want to reinforce him? Did he want to declare himself the ruler of Russia? All of that was open to speculation. But the end result was, by yesterday, a column of his troops and tanks were on the move, and they got about as far as something on the neighborhood of 150, 200 kilometers from Moscow before, out of the blue, it would appear, a deal had been struck that Prigozhin would go into a kind of exile in the neighboring nation of Belarus. His troops would not be held accountable for the mutiny or the revolt. They'd be allowed to join the regular military if they so chose, and it would be as if it was all forgiven and nothing had happened, leaving open several important questions, at least as far as we would be concerned in southern Africa. One, what does that mean for the the Wagner Group? That's the mercenary army and forces. What does it mean for their activities in Africa? Who's their leader now? How are they going to be funded? And what exactly are going to be their respective missions and plans? it's going to leave open the question of whether or not South Africa wants to deal with a now humbled and seriously weakened Vladimir Putin coming up to a meeting of, as we all know, the BRICS leaders later on in the year. And further, what does that mean generally for the place of Russia and the place of its leadership? And all these questions are now open for both debate, discussion, and a lot of head-scratching.
And essentially also opening the lid on what is happening in Russia. I mean, Ukraine President Vladimir Zelensky described it as exposing how much chaos Russia is operating under.
Well, no, that's also an important point, and I should have mentioned in the middle of everything else, what does it mean for the way in which the Russian army can, will, or should try to continue its occupation of parts of Ukraine, and what does it forebode for the way in which Ukraine will be able to carry out its long-expected counteroffensive to drive the Russians out of its territory? All of these balls are in the air all at the same time, and put it this way: would you want to be the last Russian soldier now to die for a cause which no one actually believes in anymore, on behalf of a ruler whose choice it was to go to war and who is now shown to have feet of clay as well? The thing that it evokes in my mind, because I'm old enough to remember all this, is the way in which the American army in Vietnam after about 1970-71 was increasingly ineffectual as a fighting force as opposed to a presence. Soldiers just were no longer convinced that this was a worthy endeavor, and that certainly they didn't want to be the last person to die in the process of it. And so all these questions, including the one that you urged me to mention, are clearly up in the air for us now.
And just in closing, Brooks, I mean, how should this be interpreted in the bigger scheme of things when it comes to understanding the situation at hand and what it means going forward with all the negotiation around stopping and trying to bring to an end the war? What does this element now say about the bigger picture?
Well, I guess what it says is that all the assumptions that people were making about the capabilities of the Russian army, those have to go out the window. It would appear, at least as one jokester said to me yesterday, it's now known that the Russian army is the second most powerful army inside Russia, let alone on a global sense. What it means is that all the calculations of how Russia will interact with the rest of the world, how Russia will engage with its war of choice in Ukraine, and how will the various forces within Russia sort out to whom they will owe allegiance when it really becomes awkward. All of that is open to question now. There's going to be some intense soul searching on the part of all kinds of people about the assumptions they were making, and presumably, and I go back to this because I think it's really important and it needs to be underscored, about the assumptions that have been made in the way in which South Africa's foreign policy had put itself increasingly in step with, shall we say, Russian policies, and that will have to undergo some self-examination too. Here we are Sunday morning, and we're already thinking about the insurrection in the past tense, even though the after effects of it are going to ripple forward for a very long time to come.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. Let's perhaps leave it there for now. Brooks Spector, Daily Maverick Associate Editor, speaking, of course, about the greatest threat to President Vladimir Putin's 22-year rule coming from the recent events of the Wagner Group leader. Of course, a story that we will continue to keep a very close eye on.